Recently, the Wall Street Journal did an expose on Instagram and not only their lack of enforcement towards inappropriate child content, but their algorithmic promotion of it. Quote, Instagram, the popular social media site owned by Meta Platforms, helps connect and promote a vast network of accounts openly devoted to the commission and purchase of underage sex content, according to investigations by the Wall Street Journal and researchers at Stanford University and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Hi, I'm James, and this is my very first and probably only video essay. I don't have a teleprompter, so you are definitely going to see me looking down. That's because that's where my screen is with my script. It's a pretty big script, for me at least, so I can't memorize all of it. So bear with me on that. Let's get started. I don't want to go through the whole article. It will be linked in the description so you can read the whole thing on your time. In a nutshell, the Wall Street Journal, along with Stanford and UMass Amherst, found that Instagram, just like Twitter before Elon Musk's takeover, has a serious child abuse problem that is not being addressed properly. Both perpetrators and consumers are openly connecting on Instagram via the For You algorithms as well as hashtags and other built-in ways of connecting within the platform. This has sparked debate yet again on how this problem should be handled. Some say the police or other government entities should have a team in these social media platforms to deal with the problems directly, while others say a content moderation team should be enough to take down the content. The nuance of this is interesting, with both sides having decent arguments, but with plenty of drawbacks. Let's explore both sides of this. First, we have the side of the police or government intelligence should have teams in these social media platforms to tackle the problem directly. The benefit of this is that the problem could be dealt with directly, giving the police and intelligence agencies direct access to the user's information so their investigations and subsequent cases can be done with little to no obstruction from social media platforms. They would be able to catch the content, find the account, and track down the perpetrators while using the social media's systems and data. There are a few major issues with this. First, platforms like Instagram are massive, with a global reach which extends through almost every jurisdiction in the world. This means that to avoid the potential conflict of only one government or jurisdiction having all the power, the platform would need to surrender power to every jurisdiction that demands it. This can easily result in rival governments like China, Russia, the United States, or the European Union, among others, abusing their power to enforce their laws and views on jurisdictions they should have no power over. We already see this on a cultural level, with Silicon Valley dictating the moral fiber of most of the tech platforms we see nowadays, resulting in conflicts with other, less metropolitan cultures. Another big potential issue would be espionage. Allowing intelligence agencies to access the vast and nearly infinite database of social media platforms without any hurdles can easily result in espionage into rival countries or spying on their own citizens. It would be like the Patriot Act on steroids and cocaine. But James, I hear you say, they can just give authority to the jurisdictions they are physically established in. That way, only one country would have to worry about this. Well, my dear imaginary strawman, this could potentially be worse. It is in the best interest of these social media platforms to reach as many people as possible. This means that if they only give power to the jurisdictions they're residing in, then this can create several conflicts. It can cause rival governments to either demand that the platform opens offices in their jurisdiction or will threaten to cut off the nation entirely. This would easily be the case with the US, the EU, China, Australia, and many others. This would end in a lose-lose-lose situation. The social media platform would risk losing entire jurisdictions, risk expensing opening new offices in said jurisdictions, and would potentially face backlash from the jurisdictions already in charge, not to mention the impact this would have on the people. If there's one thing we know, it is that intelligence agencies are very jealous maidens. Don't tell me you wouldn't think the EU or China or Japan or many others would demand access to Instagram if Instagram were to opt in for this option and started in the US or the UK only. And that the FBI, CIA, NSA, MI6, or the like wouldn't try to retaliate and prevent this from happening. This is simply a recipe for disaster. Second, in most Western countries, the presumption of innocence is treasured, along with the right to privacy. Now, we know that most social media platforms track everything we do, especially with the rise of our little rectangles of doom. And privacy has become a bit of a myth nowadays, with corporations sucking every last bit they can, and often do turn in data to the highest bidder, whether government or corporation. As dystopian as this is still not as bad as governments having direct access or control. Don't forget, social media platforms are still private companies who want to operate in the most efficient way possible to remain as profitable as possible. At their size, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and others struggle to even maintain a baseline of efficiency. Now imagine if your local bureaucrats were to have access to the content moderation. I assure you, it will not end well. Just imagine, people as competent as your local DMV or tax office in charge of spotting child abuse on Instagram or TikTok. This hits especially hard if you see some bureaucracies like Hungary's or the United States, and I've lived in both. I've heard many things about the bureaucratic processes in these two countries. That went smoothly was never one of them. This is without mentioning the massive China-level invasion of privacy it would entail, with agencies, whether local or global, being able to monitor every move of almost every person in the world. It is already bad enough as it is. Let's not make it worse. So that's the argument for direct government intervention in social media platforms. What about the private-only side? Social media companies should be able to moderate their content, take down the content when they find something that violates the law or their policies, and subsequently notify the authorities, right? Well, that's what got us in this mess in the first place. It seems social media platforms are either unwilling or unable to establish the necessary processes that reach a good balance between content moderation and notifying law enforcement. It seems these platforms simply don't have the processes or structures necessary to properly deal with major issues when it comes to child abuse and exploitation, or at the very least, don't do enough to prevent the less egregious or explicit, yet still predatory offenders. Many social media platforms have focused their content moderation mainly on political and cultural issues instead of legal ones, leaving the festering wound that is child abuse and exploitation to roam freely and expand without much trouble. Hell, we were making fun of people and groups for trying to rebrand themselves as part of the LGBT back in 2015. And now there's fighting in the streets of the United States because many people are trying to expose prepubescent children to sexuality. Somehow, telling people not to expose children to sexuality and sex at an early age is somehow considered anti-LGBT nowadays, and can get you banned on social media or even fired from your job. By the way, quick parentheses, can we stop calling them communities, please? I'm Latino, and I feel as much part of a community of random Latinos as I would with the Polish or Germans. These are demographics. Stop trying to collectivize and try to use your common traits with complete strangers as leverage. The LGBT is not a community. It is a series of demographics. Latino is not a community. It is a series of demographics. So on and so forth. Are there communities within these? Yes, but the overall is not a community. My community is my workplace, my Discord, my Twitch channel, my gaming buddies. You can drop me at a random Latino country and I would probably feel as part of the community as I would if you dropped me in California or Zagreb. I most likely wouldn't until I started establishing myself with a community or creating my own. Would it be easier on some places than others? Yes. But the point is that I'm not part of the community just because I share enough DNA with them. That's my view based on my experience, but it bugs me every time. Okay, rant over, back to the video. Of course, just like with the government approach, the private approach has resulted in innocent people's privacy and lives being disrupted and destroyed. Wrongful or unnecessary prosecutions by both the court of law and the court of public opinion, and major cultural conflicts that have now bled into real life. So how do we go about solving this? Letting the government get directly involved and take control is a bad idea, and so is letting the private sector simply do its thing. Well, that's where the whole point of this video comes in. I'm gonna go in a bit of a tangent, but it ties back to this, so bear with me. So far, we've talked about social media platforms, which are often referred to as simply tech platforms or companies, usually by the news. However, there's another major sector in the tech field, and that is financial technologies, or fintech for short. These companies are usually money service businesses, the most prominent of all times being PayPal, but there are other players such as Cash App, Venmo, Wise, Revolut, and many others. These companies aren't strictly speaking banks, but they do offer very similar services, such as payments, sending money, debit cards, and in some instances even holding money in several currencies, just like you would in a savings or checking account in a brick-and-mortar bank. The main difference is that usually fintech platforms don't offer loans or credit lines. They usually don't have physical branches and have a slightly different set of regulations compared to banks. Now, crimes on fintech tend to be taken a lot more seriously since it involves money. The two biggest ones being fraud and money laundering. Let's focus on the latter. Before we start this part of the video, I do need to make a disclaimer. The following section of this video is based on public knowledge and publicly accessible information. Links to all the sources will be in the description. Money laundering, for those who don't know, is the criminal act of taking illicit money, usually proceeds of other crimes, and laundering it to turn it into clean, taxable income. The U.S. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FINCEN, defines it as follows. Money laundering involves disguising financial assets so they can be used without detection of the illegal activity that produced them. Through money laundering, the criminal transforms the monetary proceeds derived from criminal activity into funds with an apparently legal source. I won't go into too much detail on the specifics of how money laundering works, but do know that Breaking Bad has an excellent explanation of the basic mechanisms of it. I'll link it in the description along with my other sources for you to check out. Money laundering is one of the very few crimes that being indicted or prosecuted for it alone is almost as bad as a conviction. This is because of how complex and deliberate this crime is. It is pretty much impossible to accidentally launder money. The schemes and structures one needs to set up for a money laundering operation are too complex and require a relatively vast network for it to be done by accident. The standard for how much evidence is needed to prosecute a case of money laundering is also very high given the nature of the crime. After all, it's the process of trying to obfuscate dirty money. Money laundering is also a big problem internationally, with many schemes being carried out by international criminal organizations like cartels, mafias, terrorist groups, etc. There's also terrorist financing, which is a similar crime to money laundering, but I'll focus on money laundering for this since terrorist financing is dealt with in a very similar way and would be a tangent on what is already a tangent in this video. Now, back to money laundering. Since it's money, governments can't directly get involved in the banking or transactions end of it, or at least don't want to, since it would be a massive breach of privacy against innocent people. The last thing a government usually wants is to piss off their wealthy population or the population that circulates money around. On the other hand, there are some cases, like HSBC Bank. They wouldn't even bother with opposing or investigating money laundering, since it simply meant more money. Meaning the private sector can't fully be trusted with dealing with the issue if left to their own devices either. So how has the issue of money laundering been tackled? In 1989, the G7 established the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, or FATF, as I like to call it. An organization focused solely on fighting money laundering and other major financial crimes. What the FATF did was create a list of recommendations, which created outlines for regulations and systems to help regulators make laws and private financial entities to create structures to investigate and report to law enforcement to fight money laundering and terrorist financing. The result of this was the creation of the Suspicious Activity Reports, or SARS for short. I won't go into too much detail on how it works because of its sensitive and confidential nature, but SARS are produced by the private financial institutions and their anti-money laundering, or AML, teams. These are trained and expert teams whose sole purpose is to fight money laundering, which means they can access sensitive information for the purposes of the investigations and reports. The confidentiality on AML teams tends to be taken very seriously, with most institutions requiring their AML teams to not disclose anything about their job, even to other co-workers outside the teams, under penalty of fines, loss of employment, or even criminal prosecution. So the way it works is, a bank or financial institution will establish a team of investigators and reporters whose sole purpose is to identify what appears to be money laundering and notify the authorities of it with SARS. I do need to make one thing clear though. SARS are not indictments or convictions, but merely the institutions notifying law enforcement of suspicious activity. It is then up to the government entities to do what they will with the reports, whether it is to start their own investigations, use the reports as evidence, or ignore and discard them. That is entirely up to law enforcement and their intelligence units. However, the penalties for failing to do this on the private institutions' end can be very strict and tough. Once again, I use HSBC as an example. They were fined £63.9 million in 2021 for failing to report over £3 billion of suspected illicit funds. That isn't even the only time the bank has been fined for this, nor their most expensive fine. In 2012, HSBC was fined $1.9 billion for failing to report money laundering that was happening in their system. There are other penalties, like losing licenses and criminal prosecution, but fines are the more common ones. Point being, there is a big effort to prevent money laundering. The FATF, the regulators, law enforcement, and the financial institutions involved that follow the FATF's recommendations make sure it is done. So how does this not result in innocent people's privacy being invaded? The FATF recommendations say that law enforcement should have access to the information related to the report's case, and only the information relevant to the case. This means that the private institutions have the obligation to provide any information relevant to the case, but can leave innocent people and innocent or irrelevant transactions out of their reports, and basically just give a copy to law enforcement of the material relevant to the case. The evidence provided to law enforcement only goes as far as the investigations made by the institutions. Law enforcement is never given direct access to the institution's systems, and if law enforcement wants or needs more, they have to send a request to the institution in question, and have to be extremely specific in doing so. They are guaranteed to get it, but aren't given full access to all the systems to do so. There is a clear line separating the public sector's action to the private sector's action, between the FATF, regulators, and law enforcement of governments, and the AML efforts of the private institutions. Both are responsible for their own side of the problem. AML's responsibility is to find, investigate, and report instances of suspected money laundering via SARS. And it is law enforcement's responsibility to turn the reports into criminal investigations or criminal cases. Public and private working together, but each with their own separate role. This is already being done, and it works fairly well, all things considered. It is a very interesting world, that of anti-money laundering, And there are sources out there that explore this concept in a lot more detail. I'm just using it as a model for my argument in this video. If you want to know more about money laundering, I recommend the Dark Money Files podcast with Graham Barrow and Ray Blake. They do a fantastic job exploring this world in more detail. Okay, now that I'm done with my tangent, how does this connect to social media and their child abuse and exploitation problem? I say we use a similar approach to the fight against money laundering. We can agree that protecting children is something of the utmost importance, even more important than money. So establishing a system and task force similar to the FATF and AML efforts with the sole purpose of fighting child abuse would be a great start. There are many activist and relatively smaller organization groups that focus on this already, such as Thorn, Digital Defenders of Children, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the EU's Britain. However, these institutions either don't have the power or the focus necessary to operate like the FATF. We need an organization on the scale and focus of the FATF that can create recommendations for anti-pedophilia content online so that governments can create the necessary regulations, while, on the other hand, social media platforms can establish their own anti-pedophilia content teams to investigate and bring to law enforcement's attention. These teams can be made of the elite of the content moderation teams, who would operate under a similar standard as AML teams do in the financial sector. This would leave a good separation between public and private, with only the suspicious content being reported to the authorities in a similar manner that money laundering is reported to law enforcement via SARS. Law enforcement agencies would get copies of the relevant information and evidence without being given direct access to the platform's systems. These teams could operate under the same standard of confidentiality with the same penalties if any party fails to a certain degree. The biggest obstacle would be identifying the users. When it comes to fintech, the FATF recommendations and regulations require the institutions to conduct ID checks. If you've signed up to services like PayPal, Wise, Binance, or other financial services, you will have noticed that you often need to provide your ID, a picture of you holding your ID, and sometimes even your address with official documents, with the penalty being limitations on your account, such as less functionality, not being able to send above a certain limit, or not being able to use your account at all. This is because the FATF recommendations say the institutions are to be prohibited from keeping anonymous accounts to help fight money laundering and other financial crimes. This is simply not the case with social media, which would create a big challenge. A possible solution: ID verification for everyone. And I don't mean Twitter blue. I mean proper customer due diligence verification. Give users the option to verify their accounts. Allow people to have a display name, sure, but have their accounts be verified the same way one does in fintech. Many people run their businesses on social media after all, so the leap wouldn't be too great. The downside to this would be the incentive. How do you incentivize people to verify their identity without massively reducing the functionality or visibility or stifling their freedom of speech and expression? In fintech, the reason is to prevent and fight money laundering and other crimes. Freedom of expression is enshrined in many constitutions and laws, in many cases being almost absolute, with often exceptions being incitement, defamation, slander, threats, or similar. Financial law is a lot more defined, which allows for the limitations to be more easily defined. This is certainly a challenge and possibly the greatest obstacle to my proposed solution. If it were up to me, I'd simply make the checkmark systems we've come to know to be open to everyone, with different types of verification for individuals, businesses, shows, bots, etc. The user can change their display name, picture, etc., and potentially even create as many accounts as desired on top of the original, but all are still tied to the main verified account. Kind of how fintech does business accounts, where you create a personal account and then on top of that, you can register your business. That's called being a signatory, and it's very common all over the world. Accounts without verification would simply not have the checkmark, and it would come at the cost of some functionality, like uploading images, videos, or sharing external links or links from non-verified accounts. This is another rabbit hole I do not want to get into right now. How do we define external links? How do we fight coordinated perpetrators? How do we set up the necessary processes to incentivize verification and make sure perpetrators are dealt with? How do you ensure the user's information is kept safe? I guess that's what discourse, the task forces, legislation, and the private sector's process management would be for. The main challenge would be how much to take away from those who wish to remain completely anonymous, given that freedom of speech is almost as precious as children's innocence. Scaling would also have to be taken into consideration for this, given how massive these social media platforms are. But I think it should be done regardless, and I think it is possible to address it properly. Like in AML, social media platforms would subdivide their efforts by jurisdictions, allowing for teams to be organized and act according to local regulations. Usually, the world is divided into North America, Latin America, Europe, Middle East and Africa, Asia, and Pacific by most companies. I'm pretty sure social media platforms already have this structured, just like most other tech platforms. So it wouldn't be too big a leap to set this up for the purposes of fighting child abuse and exploitation. There are many other complications that come with this, of course, such as the handling of the content, expenses, logistics, and legality. However, I do think it would be a proper response to a problem that has only gotten worse over the years, and a problem that social media platforms have ignored and neglected for far too long. The model is there. AML has existed for many years now. The fight never ends, but at least something is being done about the crimes that happen. Except HSBC, apparently. Social media platforms should do the same and tackle their child abuse problem. And that's it. That's my first video essay. Do let me know what you think in the comments, whether it is the approach to the problem, my proposed solution, or even the production of this video. The sources I used, as well as a few things I mentioned, are linked in the description. I usually just watch video essays, but felt compelled to make this video given that now we know the extent of this issue. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I usually hang out on my Discord channel or do music and gaming streams, and occasionally release music or audiobooks of Warhammer 40k short stories. Feel free to subscribe and follow if you haven't already. Do share the video so that we can spread the word about this. This, as you probably saw if you're this far in the video, by the way, thank you. This is not just bashing social media or bashing people or any of the like. This is me trying to come up with a realistic, tangible solution to a very real problem that has existed for far too long, using a model that already exists in an industry that is pretty much as big as social media. So if it can be done in the banking sector, it might be possible in the social media sector. That's just my thoughts. Of course, I tried to make this as neutral and grounded as possible, more of focused on the solution rather than the problem. I do have my opinions, but I decided to leave those out of this video so that we can focus on the solution here. Do let me know what you think, and again, do share the video with everybody. Streams should be coming back soon, especially the Jam and Shreds, where you request songs and I play along to them with my 7-string guitar. Once I'm done healing from a back injury. I've been injured, so there's that. Do join the Discord if you want to hang out and enjoy the memes and get notified of when I do stuff. I am James R. Bastard, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.